Good morning. Welcome to Member Focus Monday. I'm Christina Schaefer, Social Media Manager for HAR. I'm joined this morning by Julia Parento. We are going to have Julia introduce herself here in just a moment, and we have a lot of great stuff to talk about with her. But I do want to say just from the very top that we are thankful to have another sponsor this morning. We are sponsored by ManageRentHouses.com. They were on with us a few weeks ago and told us all about the services that they offer our members. So thank you, ManageRentHouses.com, for sponsoring Member Focus Monday and for sponsoring our HAR On Move podcast. So Julia, welcome.
Thank you.
How are you this morning?
I am great. I hope you are as well.
Yes. So if we could just start, if you could just maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, your background,
Sure.
So that our members know who you are.
Absolutely. I am your Associate Director of Legislative Affairs here at Texas Realtors. What that means is that primarily I'm a part of your lobbying team that is at the Capitol during legislative session, working with our policy issues committees and our legislative management team during our interims, and working on all of those wonderful ideas that eventually become bills with the Texas legislature. In addition to that, I also help work on our issues mobilization program, so that's a side project. I have almost 20 years of experience in realtor, legislative, and government affairs. I've worked for a number of different local and state associations around the country, and I came and joined Texas Realtors here in January of 2017. Just in time for the last legislative session to start.
I was going to say, so they got you busy right from the start there.
Yes, jumped right in. Week one, I was in the Capitol.
So speaking of busy, I know that you guys have been very busy the last few months up there in Austin. Can you just tell us, and we'll get into some more detail in a minute with a few specific issues, but what were some of the biggest wins this legislative session?
Well, of course, Senate Bill 2, which was the property tax reform bill, coupled with House Bill 3 that reformed our school finance system. Those were the two biggest, and we've, along with everybody else in Texas, have been working on those issues for years.
Sure.
And so those were the biggest of the big. But so many other great things happened this session, including our real estate commission, sunset review, and a whole bunch of other transactional things that we can talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, sure. What about, and those were a lot of things that we were supporting, what about maybe things that we were opposing, any topics that we were opposing?
Yes, well, as everybody knows, real estate is such a regulated industry, and it's so important to our economy and our communities that everybody everywhere always wants to make laws related to it, and many of them are good. But not all of them. And so this session, like many others in the past, we saw proposals that would have required mandatory sales price disclosure every time a property is sold. We opposed all of those. And we saw some very creative attempts to get those ideas tacked on as amendments on the House floor to other bills. All of them failed, so that was great for us to see. We also opposed bills that related to appraisal caps, and sometimes people wonder why we do that, because they see the link between your appraisal value and your property tax bill. But as we'll talk about with Senate Bill 2, we oppose appraisal caps because they're an artificial government regulation on the value of your property. And they are your appraisal value is only one part of your property tax equation. And so with Senate Bill 2, you'll see that we focused a lot more on how your local entities actually assess property taxes as the way to solve that problem, instead of putting a cap from the government on what your value is. We also, one last thing I'll mention in the opposition column, we did also wind up opposing a bill that related to short-term rentals, which I know is an issue for so many of our members, both in the pro and the con column. But ultimately, there was a bill that sought to create a regulatory framework around short-term rentals at the state level, because right now cities kind of are just making their own rules as they go, or some of them are not making any at all, and some of them are going so far as to ban short-term rentals. So this bill was an attempt to put a statewide structure around how those properties can be regulated, a concept that Texas Realtors has supported unfortunately, the bill, as it was presented in its committee, treated property owners differently. So some property owners had one set of rules, and other property owners had a different set of rules. And given Texas Realtors' devotion to private property rights, that was not something we could support. So we opposed that bill. It did not pass, but it's an issue we'll continue to work on in the coming years.
Very good. And hopefully our members that are tuning in right now can already see that these issues hit right home. So that's why we titled this, the new laws and your business, because these do directly reflect realtors' business, but also any realtor that is also a private property owner. It's going to affect you anyway, right? So
exactly.
It's important for us to be aware of what's going on and new laws that we'll be seeing. So let's get in a little more depth. You mentioned TREC Sunset Review. Can you explain to us, what that is?
Sure.
Yeah, just go ahead and explain to us what it is.
Okay, so you might have heard the term sunset review tossed around, especially this year with the Real Estate Commission being on the list. To take a quick step back, the state of Texas has a state agency called the Sunset Agency, and they are tasked with looking at all of the other state agencies that are established. The Texas Medical Board, the accountants, the architects, whoever it might be that has a state regulatory agency. And the Sunset Group looks at them periodically, every agency, to evaluate for efficiencies, to make sure they're doing the job they were set up to do, to make sure it still makes sense to even have the agency exist, and where there are places where they could be more efficient or serve their customers a little bit better. They make recommendations that then go through the legislature to turn into bills.
Okay.
So the Real Estate Commission was on the list in they do the reviews in the interim years between the legislative sessions. And so the Real Estate Commission was under sunset review throughout 2018. And they dug into all of the customer service processes, how the agency is structured, all sorts of things like that. And then they came out with a 71-page book of recommendations.
Just a few, right?
You know what? And that's pretty normal. That's what they're supposed to do. And they found some places where probably, the folks out there listening could have said, yeah, we saw some problems like that. They saw some problems with customer service. They saw some problems with, simply answering phones, with how long it was taking to issue licenses and how that process was working. So they made some recommendations to make all of that a little bit better. And then that became the TREC Sunset Bill, and that went through the legislative process. So we were really excited to see how it turned out. I apologize, my office phone is ringing. We were excited to see how that came out. We really think that the outcome will be that the Real Estate Commission sees some great improvements. Simultaneously, not on purpose exactly, it just the timing worked out this way. We also had some TREC Commission leadership whose terms were ending at the beginning of this year. So during the legislative session, the governor and the Senate were going through the process of nominating some new folks to fill those vacancies on the commission. So we now have a new chair, a new vice chair for the Real Estate Commission, and we're excited to see what they do. So the commission, the Real Estate Commission, will have to go through and work on the changes that the legislature recommended. Again, primarily they deal with the customer service angle and how TREC is answering their phones and dealing with licensure and all of that. They'll do some very early reporting back to the legislature and to the Sunset Agency, starting as soon as this fall. And then typically, agencies are reviewed about every 12 years. But the legislature was interested in making sure that these changes were implemented. So they'll actually be bringing the Real Estate Commission back for another review in 6. So in 6 years, we'll go through this whole process again and just make sure that things are progressing in the way they're supposed to progress.
That's really great. I mean, and obviously TREC is they're set to regulate the real estate industry in Texas, but even the regulators need some regulation, right? So
exactly.
I was going to ask you, how these recommendations will affect our members, but it seems pretty obvious that
we hope in the positive. Yes,
yeah,
that is the intent.
Customer service issues and things like that. We always appreciate shorter phone calls, right?
Right, exactly. We hope that in sometime in the very near future that your every phone call into the Real Estate Commission will be answered on the second ring.
There we go.
And so we'll be right there ready to help you.
Yes.
The good news is, of course, that part of the reason that the Real Estate Commission is so busy is that there's so many people who want to come to Texas and buy and sell real estate. We have so many people moving here, which is wonderful, of course, for those of everybody out in the world working on transactions, but they can do better, and we think they will. So
that's wonderful. So Senate Bill 2, you said this is one of the big wins as well, property tax reform.
Yes.
Obviously, property tax is, again, one of those issues that affects all of us. So tell us a little bit about that.
So Senate Bill 2 is the culmination of a multi-year effort to reform the Texas property tax system. Which is complicated, and it still will be a little bit complicated, but we're going to work on making sure that all the taxpayers out there in the state get better education on how the system works, and we're going to be helped in that effort by a lot of what was passed in Senate Bill 2. So the primary thing that Texas Realtors was so excited about to see pass in that bill is a big slate of transparency measures. So Texas taxpayers are going to get a lot better information about what their property tax bill means, who is responsible for levying those taxes, and what they can do about it. One of the things that will be required after the implementation of Senate Bill 2, which goes into effect in January 1st of 2020, is that your central appraisal districts will now be building out websites in which you can get real-time information about all of the different taxing entities, because some folks might have up to 8 different governmental bodies that are levying taxes on them, right? So it could be their county, their city, their school district, and then a whole slate of special districts, hospitals, MUDs, junior colleges, all of that. So the new websites from the central appraisal districts will have real-time information about your specific information about who is responsible for each part of your property tax bill, and we'll give you contact information for how you can reach out to them and talk about their budgets, how they are setting their tax rates, and what they are going to do going forward to collect and spend your revenue. So that's going to make a huge difference for a lot of folks. In addition to that, what got talked about probably the most in the media and just in the chatter circles all around the state during the session was the rollback rate. Now, the rollback rate, just so everybody knows, is the rate at which if a taxing entity, if a city or a county or anybody who levies a tax exceeds a certain percentage from previous year's tax rates. In the past, it was 8%. If they went over 8%, then the folks who live in that district had the option to circulate a petition and get a required number of signatures, and then bring that back and have an election on whether that tax rate should proceed. That rate has now been reduced to 3.5%. And instead of having a petition, it's just going to be an automatic election. So if a taxing entity exceeds that rollback rate, it'll go automatically to the voters for approval. So they've actually renamed the rollback rate. We're not going to say those words anymore. It is now the voter approval rate. And hopefully with the automatic elections, it's going to put a lot more control in taxpayers' hands. Now, I should be clear that it does not apply to every single taxing entity in the state of Texas. There are some special districts that are excluded from it, some very small districts that don't raise a ton of money. Some special districts like junior colleges, those are not included in that, and they're still going to stay at that original 8%. But for the vast majority, they should see that 3.5% voter approval rate. We're still working on getting used to saying that. Voter approval rate going forward in 2020.
Okay, that's great. It sounds like from what you're saying, more transparency and more control for taxpayers.
Exactly. And we're careful to say this is property tax reform. This should help slow the rapid rate of growth that has been happening over the last, well, gosh, we'd say the last couple of years, but it's probably the last 20 years that we've seen such extreme rates of growth in our property taxes. This will slow that down. It's going to put a lot of controls around how your property tax money is collected and subsequently spent by your local taxing entities.
Okay. So, House Bill 3.
Yes.
School finance reform.
Yes. House Bill 3 passed, authored by Dan Huberty from your area. Again, a multi-year effort to work on how we fund public schools in Texas. I believe the governor has said this is the most significant reform to school finance that he has ever seen. So we're excited to see how it plays out. And of course, you can't talk about property tax reform without talking about how we pay for schools, since most of your property tax money is going to fund our public schools. So House Bill 3 is going to inject about $11.5 billion into our public school system. They are going to make some changes to how the state gives money for students with learning disabilities, for students with English as a second language. They're really focusing a lot on students who are disadvantaged in one way or another, whether it's through learning disabilities or other special needs. They're trying to make sure that schools have additional resources to help teach those kids. They're increasing the basic allotment, which is the allocated set of money that the state gives per every kid in every school district. That's going up significantly. They're also increasing teacher pay and requiring school districts to put into the teacher retirement system, which is not currently a requirement. So those folks will be supported as they move forward. And then, of course, from our perspective, in addition to all of the wonderful things that come from having a successful public school system that's educating kids and making sure they're trained for life when they graduate, House Bill 3 has a $5 billion property tax buy down. And it's a little bit complicated. It's not quite as simple to say that the school rollback / voter approval rate is this, but ultimately what it boils down to is it moves from the original 8% to 2.5% now for schools. So whereas that rate for the cities and counties and all those other taxing entities is 3.5%, the schools is going to be at 2.5%. So if they exceed that rate, that will go to the voters for approval. So that, again, will be a significant regulator on the growth rate of property taxes all around the state. But
and Stephen, you was asking what was the result of the education report, so hopefully that answered your questions, Stephen. And if anyone else has questions for Julia, go ahead and type those in, and we will get to those questions in just a little bit. Lady said, "Go Dan Huberty."
He worked so hard on that. It was his entire session.
Yeah.
And Larry Taylor on the Senate side from Friendswood and Galveston. So thanks. Both of them were so committed to that.
Thank you. Stephen actually asked, will they review the Robin Hood rules for education? HISD Houston is severely underfunded.
Yes. So House Bill 3, the way it's structured, does take down the recapture structure. Let me restate that. It will reduce the rate of recapture payments that school districts around the state are required to pay. The system is still there. The equity sharing system that was the original intent of the Robin Hood program has not been deleted entirely. But the way that the bill compresses tax rates and changes the funding from the state side, independent school districts from around the state are going to be required to put a whole lot less money into the recapture program. So that should be a good benefit to those districts.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about disaster relief. Obviously, we're still seeing effects of Hurricane Harvey in our area and other parts of the state. We've had several storms in the last few years that have caused some devastation, but there were several bills around disaster relief. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, it was a huge focus for the legislature this session. Hurricane Harvey was still fresh on so many people's minds, and there was, I couldn't even tell you, honestly, how many bills got filed to try to do some kind of disaster relief, ranging from massive injections of money from the rainy day fund down to little tiny tweaks to systems for how we fund infrastructure and create and build our flood mitigation systems. So it was a huge focus this year. The biggest bills that got a lot of attention, there were three from the Senate, Senate Bill 6, 7, and 8, that do a whole bunch of things. They create a couple of different new funds for infrastructure and for flooding to make sure that we are prepared in the future. One creates a disaster response system that's going to go statewide. And there's a big infusion of money from the rainy day fund included in those bills. So we'll see a lot of changes, I think, in how we build and think about infrastructure across the state of Texas. One that was, well, there's a couple that are specific to real estate. One that we worked on very closely, especially at the end of session, related to property taxes. But I want to talk about it in terms of the disaster response. It had to do with what happens after the disaster. The current structure for property taxes after a disaster in Texas says that if a governor declares a disaster, your local districts can do a reappraisal of property in their areas to see if they should be assessed lower taxes going forward because of disaster, if they were damaged or completely wiped away in a disaster. The reappraisal process, it was voluntary. It was a local option to do so. And frankly, a reappraisal is expensive for local districts to do, and not too many of them took that option when a disaster had occurred. And so that was an issue that we looked at a lot this session to see what we could do to make it better, because, it's just not okay to kick people when they're down. And if you're staring at a slab following a hurricane, you probably should not have to pay
Right.
full taxes after that. So we had a couple of different versions of bills that were going through the process. Ultimately, it was a House bill and a constitutional amendment. There's two parts to it that did pass from Hugh Schein up in here in Central Texas area, who carried those bills. And ultimately, what they said is that instead of doing a reappraisal, the local entities will give a temporary tax exemption to folks who have seen damage from a disaster. And as far as the mandatory or option, it will be mandatory at the front end of the year as long as the local entity has not yet set their tax rate. That tax exemption will be mandatory. After that, they will have the option to implement it, but we expect that a lot of them will take that option. It's a much simpler system than doing the reappraisal. It will be based off of the damage assessments that your counties and FEMA, if they're there, already do of all of the properties that are damaged. And so we hope to see some good relief for folks when they most need it with those bills. And that will become a constitutional amendment that will be on your ballot in November. In addition to that, one that we're pretty excited about, and we hope you all are too, is a pretty significant reform to our seller's disclosure related to flooding. This was Senate Bill 339 by Joan Huffman there in your area. And it is probably the most comprehensive reform of the seller's disclosure that we have seen since it was originally created back in the early 90s. The bill adds nearly a whole page to the seller's disclosure, which sounds like a lot, but they're important questions, and they're all related to flood and other damage of that type. So it's going to ask questions about whether the property is in special flood hazard areas, we're moving a bit away from the discussion of 100 or 500 year floodplains, because that's not actually a term that FEMA uses. It's a sort of just a common phrase, but if you go to FEMA's website and search your property, that's not a phrase that comes up. So we wanted to make sure that the words on the disclosure where a buyer might be doing their own research actually matches with what's out there in the world. Okay. So they're going to talk about the special flood hazard areas. They're going to ask if the property has had flooding on the structure or on the property elsewhere. And it's going to ask if the property owner has received insurance payments from a homeowner's insurance policy, from FEMA, from other government programs out there that are designed to do flood mitigation, and all sorts of good questions that we really think are going to give buyers a much better sense of what they're looking at. And also, they're questions that the sellers can answer. And so they're not going to add a great deal of burden on the seller side. One specifically that we did some grappling with because it was important, but you had to really figure out the right way to say it, was how to deal with those properties, especially after Hurricane Harvey, that were flooded as a result of the reservoirs when they had to do the emergency releases of those dams. And so there is a question there that relates to that. It's very specific. Again, it's one that the property owners will definitely know if that happened to them. But it had started out in an earlier draft, much more vague. They were trying to look at properties in a really big area and just say, if you're 5 miles within anything, put this down. And we eventually got it, much more focused and better for the property owners to be able to answer. So we're excited to see that form roll out. I believe the effective date on that is September 1st of 2019. Okay. So we'll see that in the field
very soon. Yes. And I'm glad to hear that it sounds that you guys really worked hard with them to make it as specific and clear as possible, because I know when Joan Hutchinsville was first introduced, there was a lot of concern. Well, they already answered 2 questions. What more could they say? But it sounds like you guys really did work hard with them to make sure that the questions that are on there are questions that the seller actually can answer, and like you're saying, the buyer can actually understand as well.
Right. Yeah. We're excited about it. I saw a news report on it that said that Texas will now have the most comprehensive seller's disclosure on these issues, probably of any state in the country. And we really think that's a good thing for folks who are going to be involved in those transactions.
And if there are any other questions for Julia, go ahead and type those in, and we'll get to those in just a moment. So you already mentioned one thing that we should be looking for on the November ballot. Is there anything specific that we should be looking forward to in November?
Yes, there were 10 joint resolutions that were passed, which is the legislative term for a bill that will become a constitutional amendment. We're still going through all of those to see what kinds of impacts they'll have for the Texas realtors community, but 2 specifically, the one related to the disaster property tax temporary exemption. That is one for sure. And there will be one that relates to those, the new funds that I mentioned for infrastructure and flooding. So they'll have that one as well. The Secretary of State will draw the numbers for those in August. So I don't have proposition numbers yet to tell everybody. But as soon as we know what those are, they do it by a lottery system. They kind of just pull the ballot out, or pull the language out and say, okay, you're number 1. So that will happen in August, and then we'll get to work making sure that you all know what numbers are going to be important.
Very good. Just a comment from Lainey. She said, the new disclosures include definitions. I suppose sellers can't claim they don't know or didn't understand.
Well, yeah, and the seller still may not know the answer to the question, and that's okay. The seller does not necessarily know everything about their property. So exactly like the seller's disclosure is set up right now, they still have that option to say, I am not aware of this condition.
They have to answer within their knowledge.
Yes, exactly. but there are definitions there, and that is so that both parties make sure they know what question they're answering. Yes.
So I have in front of me this recap of the 86th Texas legislature. Where can our members find this? Because it's only a couple pages, and it's a great little recap.
Yeah, we're working on getting a comprehensive publication put together that'll be in your next issue of the Texas Realtor magazine, which will be, of course, in print and online. Mm-hmm. There is a shorter summary of that on the TexasRealEstate.com blog page, which you can, it has a long website, but you can find it if you go to TexasRealEstate.com and to the blog, it's there. And you can also go to TexasRealEstate.com on the member side, just the government affairs page. And if you go to legislative advocacy, it's right there at the top in a blue box, and you can check that out.
And if you're signed up for emails from Texas Realtors, you probably got something last week as well. I know I had a couple of emails come through from you guys recapping the session, so that was great to get as well.
Yep, you'll get emails on the blog. If you're signed up on the Legislative Liaison, you'll get the periodic publications that go out there as well.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you wanted to share with our members?
We are just so grateful that Texas Realtors all around the state are so focused and so committed to legislative and political advocacy. Your engagement makes the organization a success. When the legislature is here, you have an incredible strength in your numbers, in the commitment that all of our members have to advocacy for private property rights, the real estate, housing, community development industry. And we just feel really lucky to work for you. So thank you for letting us be here and having us represent you at the Capitol, and let's keep working together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule this morning for us. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yes, and also thank you again to ManagementHouses.com. They're our sponsor today for Member Focus Monday, and they're a sponsor for HAR On The Move podcast. So we're very happy to have them. Thank you. Next Monday, we will have Rania Mancuris, with Crime Stopper. She's their CEO. She's going to be on sharing with us all of the wonderful things that Crime Stoppers are doing locally here in Houston to prevent crime and keep our citizens safe. So we'll see you next Monday at 9 a.m. Have a great week.